6 hours. That is roughly how long exposed human skin takes to develop frostbite in freezing wind, according to modern cold weather medicine. Now imagine spending 5 months a year, every year, for your entire life in conditions at least that harsh, using nothing you would recognize as a coat, a furnace, or a heated room. That was not a hypothetical for your ancestors. It was an annual event, arriving on schedule whether anyone in the group was ready for it or not. And somehow, generation after generation, enough of them made it through to the other side of winter that you exist to hear this sentence right now. So here is the actual question worth asking. How did any of that work? What did they have in a world with no metal, no glass, and no woven fabric that made the difference between a group that saw spring and a group that simply did not? Most people picture this with the same tired image. A caveman wrapped in a single loose animal skin, teeth chattering, huddled at the mouth of a cave, barely surviving until spring through sheer stubbornness and luck. That picture is almost entirely wrong, and the archaeological evidence collected in just the last few years makes that clear. What ancient humans built to survive winter was closer to a coordinated engineering system than a lucky accident. Clothing designed with actual tailoring, shelters constructed from the bones of the largest animals on the continent, fire management sophisticated enough to keep a flame alive through a blizzard, food stockpiled months in advance against a season that offered almost nothing fresh to eat, and, according to one genuinely disputed piece of evidence, possibly something even stranger than any of that. Here is how researchers reconstruct any of this, because there were obviously no written records left behind to consult. Picture a forensic investigator walking through a burned building long after the fire is out, with no witnesses left to interview. Every scorch mark, every collapsed beam, every displaced object still tells a story if you know how to read it correctly. Archaeologists do something almost identical with bones and stone tools, tens of thousands of years old, except their crime scene is scattered across an entire continent and buried under thousands of years of sediment. A cut mark on a specific spot of an animal bone means something completely different depending on its angle, its depth, and exactly where it sits relative to the joint. A mark near a joint with almost no meat attached usually means only one thing: somebody was not butchering that animal for food. They were removing its skin carefully enough to keep it intact. That distinction is exactly how one of the oldest known pieces of evidence for clothing was identified. At a site called Schöningen in northern Germany, researchers examined the paw bones of ancient cave bears, animals roughly the size of a modern polar bear, and found cut marks in places that made no sense at all for meat processing. There is almost no usable meat on a paw. The marks sat precisely where a hunter would cut to peel a pelt cleanly off the body without tearing it. Those bones have been dated to roughly 300,000 years ago. Let that number sink in. It means the practice of using animal fur as clothing may be more than 10 times older than modern humans have existed as a species. Whoever wore that bear skin was almost certainly not simply cold and desperate in the moment. The group had already figured out, probably across generations of trial and error, which animal produced the warmest, most weatherproof material available to them in that specific landscape, and how to remove it without ruining the very thing that made it useful. A hunter kneeling over a bear carcass in the freezing air would have worked a stone flake carefully around the paw joints instead of hacking through them the way he would for meat, because ruining the pelt here meant someone in his group would be colder in 4 months when it mattered. That kind of restraint, choosing a slower, more careful cut for a payoff months away instead of the fastest way to get at the meat, is not instinct. It is planning of a kind we do not usually credit people from this period with having at all. For a very long stretch of time after that first bear pelt, clothing stayed relatively simple. Loose hides wrapped and draped around the body, doing an adequate job of blocking wind but doing very little in the way of trapped, insulating air around the skin. Then something changed the entire equation, quietly and permanently. Small tools carved from bone or ivory, with a tiny hole drilled through one end, using a fine stone point, start appearing in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago. A sewing needle. It sounds almost too ordinary a detail to matter, sitting next to bear skins and mammoth bones, but it changed everything downstream of it. Loose hides could now be cut to shape and stitched into fitted, layered garments, closer to what we would call clothes than to simple draped fur thrown over the shoulders. Think about the difference this made for one specific person. A hunter standing at the edge of camp at dawn, wind cutting straight through a loose hide at the neckline and cuffs, versus a hunter in a garment sewn tight at those same gaps. The needle did not just make clothing. It made clothing that worked as insulation rather than clothing that simply existed. Some researchers studying this period have gone as far as calling the needle one of the single most important inventions in the entire history of the species, not because it looks impressive sitting in a museum case, but because of how much winter survival, and therefore how much population growth into colder regions depended on it existing at all. Populations without that specific technology appear to have stayed largely confined to milder climates, while populations that had it were able to push steadily further north, into places a loose, undraped hide simply could not keep anyone alive. Clothing alone does not get an entire group through 5 months of freezing temperatures. You also need somewhere to actually be warm, and somewhere to keep a fire burning without it going out the moment the wind picks up outside. In parts of Eastern Europe, hunter-gatherer groups solved this using an available resource nobody today would think to reach for first. Mammoths. At a site now called Mezherik, in what is currently Ukraine, archaeologists uncovered several large circular structures built almost entirely from mammoth bones and tusks, stacked and arranged with clear intention rather than randomly scattered by chance or flooding. Recent radiocarbon dating places one of these structures at roughly 18,000 years old, right in the harshest phase of the last ice age, and suggests at least one of them may have been returned to and used across a span of centuries, not just a single desperate season by one group passing through. That required coordinated planning on a scale easy to underestimate today. Someone had to locate, hunt, or scavenge enough enormous animal bones to build an entire wall out of them. Figuring out how those specific bones could be layered and braced to hold their shape through wind load and heavy snow, with no written instructions to consult, took its own kind of expertise. And someone had to decide this exact location was worth the effort of returning to, year after year, hauling hides and repairing bone walls, rather than simply moving on and starting from nothing somewhere else. Picture a family inside one of those structures. During the deepest part of that 18,000-year-old winter, firelight moving across walls built from the curved ribs and skulls of animals, larger than anything alive in that landscape today. Snow piling silently against the outside of a wall assembled, bone by people who had never seen a written blueprint and did not need one. Shelter itself was rarely just a cave used as nature left it, despite how that gets simplified in popular imagination. Even where natural caves existed, groups routinely modified them, draping large animal hides across the entrance to block wind that would otherwise cut straight through the opening, and building smaller wind-blocking walls out of stacked stone at the mouth, where the terrain offered no natural overhang at all. In places with no caves within reach, groups dug rounded pits partway into the earth and built a dome-shaped frame over the top, insulated with turf, sod, and more hides, effectively manufacturing an artificial cave where the landscape had refused to provide a real one. The specific choice of shelter design changed from region to region, depending entirely on what materials the local landscape actually offered. But the underlying engineering goal never did. Block the wind first, trap the heat second. Everything else about the structure existed to serve those two requirements. And nothing else. Fire itself required its own constant, unglamorous labor that rarely gets mentioned in the popular version of this story. A flame does not simply keep burning through an ice age winter on its own, tended by nobody. Groups had to carry embers with them when they moved camp, because starting a new fire from nothing in freezing, often damp conditions, was neither fast nor guaranteed to work on the first attempt. Flint and pyrite, the specific stones capable of throwing a spark hot enough to catch dry tinder, appear to have been treated as genuinely valuable possessions, not simply picked up wherever convenient and discarded afterward. Someone in every group likely held the specific, learned responsibility of tending that flame, making sure it survived through the night, through storms, through the long stretches of darkness that define a polar winter. Losing it was not a minor inconvenience to shrug off until morning. In the coldest stretches, it could plausibly mean losing everyone depending on it for warmth, cooked food, and protection from whatever was moving through the dark outside camp. The specific person given that responsibility woke repeatedly through a single night, every few hours, just to feed a handful of fuel into coals that could not be allowed to die, while everyone else slept, depending entirely on that one person staying awake and paying attention. That job did not end in the morning. It repeated every night, all winter, for as long as the group intended to survive it. The body itself was doing quiet engineering work of its own, separate from anything a person consciously built or sewed. Surviving a calorie-scarce winter on a body that size and activity level required a heavy seasonal reliance on stored fat, both the fat carried on a person's own body going into winter and the rendered animal fat carried in their food supply. Lean meat alone, without that fat, can leave a person malnourished no matter how much of it they eat, a real danger sometimes called rabbit starvation in more recent survival literature. Ice Age hunters appear to have understood this instinctively even without the biochemistry to explain it, deliberately targeting fatty animals and rendering fat from bones and marrow, rather than discarding them. Because a group that had plenty of protein but no fat reserves, going into a hard winter, was still, in a very real sense, starving. Food told the same story of advanced planning rather than desperate improvisation. In parts of what is now eastern France, Ice Age hunters are known to have built fires each autumn specifically to funnel entire migrating herds of horses and reindeer into a narrow valley where they could be killed efficiently, in bulk, in a single coordinated effort. The meat from that single event was then dried and stored to last through the winter months, when almost nothing fresh could be found or grown anywhere nearby. This was not one lucky hunt feeding one lucky week. It was a deliberate, repeated strategy, aimed specifically at surviving a season that had not even arrived yet. Somebody, months before the first snowfall, had to correctly predict how much food an entire group would need to last until spring, and organize the labor to actually secure that amount in advance. Then process and dry it fast enough before it spoiled, then store it somewhere neither animals nor rot could reach it through an entire winter. And then there is the piece of this story that even researchers studying it are still genuinely arguing about loudly in published journals. At a cave system called Cima de los Huesos in northern Spain, scientists examining hominin bones roughly 400,000 years old found something unusual. Specific lesions and growth disruptions in the bone tissue concentrated heavily among adolescent individuals, closely resembling patterns seen in animals that hibernate through winter. Here is where it matters to separate two different claims: that these hominins suffered real, measurable metabolic stress from a harsh, food-scarce winter is not seriously disputed. That this stress specifically means true hibernation, a bear-like dormant state, rather than simple malnutrition or chronic illness, is the actual point of disagreement. A pair of researchers published an analysis in 2020 arguing for the hibernation specifically. Other researchers studying the exact same bones remain openly skeptical, pointing out that the same lesions can result from conditions that have nothing to do with slowing the body down on purpose. As of right now, this remains unresolved, not a settled fact you can repeat with total confidence at a dinner party. Could an entire human population really have gone dormant for months at a time, the way a bear or a ground squirrel does? Human biology today does not obviously support anything close to true hibernation, which is exactly why the claim stays controversial rather than accepted. But 400,000 years is a long stretch of evolutionary time, and the population at that site was dealing with a winter harsh enough and food scarce enough that the question is worth investigating rather than dismissing outright. Not every adaptation to that cold was cultural or invented at all. Some of it was simply built into the body over enormous stretches of time. Populations that lived in these colder regions for many thousands of generations, including Neanderthals living across Ice Age Europe, tended toward shorter, stockier builds, compared to populations from warmer regions, a body shape that loses heat more slowly relative to its size. The same basic principle that makes a small, compact object cool down slower than a long, thin one of equal mass. None of that came from a decision anyone made. It came from thousands of years of the coldest individuals in the coldest winters being slightly more likely to survive and have children across countless generations, until the entire population's average shape had quietly shifted toward whatever the climate rewarded, without a single individual ever choosing it or even noticing it happening across their own lifetime. Step back for a second and look at everything stacked together in one place. Bearskin clothing dated back 300,000 years. Needles that turned loose hides into fitted garments 40,000 years ago. Mammoth-bone architecture engineered to outlast a single season. Fire tended constantly, carried between camps, treated as a genuine lifeline rather than a background convenience. Meat hunted and dried months in advance of a season that had not started yet. And possibly, in at least one population, something as strange as a slowed, hibernation-like state during the very worst stretch of cold. None of this reads like desperate improvisation happening once, out of raw panic. It reads like a set of solved problems, refined and quietly passed down. generation after generation, by people who had every reason to take winter as seriously as anything else in their entire lives, because it genuinely could end their lives, every single year, without exception. There is something worth sitting with in how differently we experience the exact same season now. For most people watching this, winter means a minor inconvenience at most, a slightly longer commute, a jacket pulled out of the closet for a few months, a thermostat nudged up 2 degrees without a second thought given to it. None of that requires planning that spans months in advance. None of it requires one specific person tending a single irreplaceable flame through the night, and none of it carries any real risk of it ending badly for anyone involved. That gap between an entire engineered survival system and a thermostat dial on a wall did not open up because winter itself became less dangerous somewhere along the way. The season is exactly as cold as it always was, arriving on the same schedule it always has. What changed is that every single piece of the ancient system, the clothing, the shelter, the fire, the stored food, has been quietly automated and hidden behind a wall switch or a supermarket aisle, to the point that most of us never have to think about any of it at all for our entire lives. Most people alive right now could not build a fire from scratch in freezing rain if their heating failed tonight, could not identify which animal fat would actually keep them warm, and could not construct shelter from raw materials, even if their life genuinely depended on it by morning. That is not a criticism. It is simply what happens when a system gets solved well enough by enough earlier generations that solving it yourself stops being necessary. We know roughly what the individual pieces of this survival system looked like, spread out across hundreds of thousands of years and multiple regions. We do not fully know how they were originally taught within a group, whether through direct instruction, careful imitation, trial and error passed down as painful lessons, or some combination none of us can fully reconstruct from bones and stone tools alone. And we still do not know, with any real confidence either way, whether that one unsettling piece of evidence from Spain means an entire population once slowed their bodies down and slept through a season none of us today could survive unprepared for even a single night. Maybe the honest answer is simpler than any single explanation. Winter demanded everything ancient humans had to offer, all at once every year, with no room for a single serious mistake. Clothing, architecture, fire, stored food, and possibly biology itself. And, generation after generation, that combination turned out to be exactly enough, right up until it was not for the specific populations who did not make it through. Every piece of evidence covered in this video exists specifically because it belonged to a group that survived long enough to leave it behind. Somewhere underneath all of it are the populations who tried a slightly worse shelter design, cured a pelt slightly less carefully, or let a fire go out on the wrong night. They left nothing at all for anyone to find. Archaeology, almost by definition, only ever gets to tell the story of the ones who made it. The failures simply are not there to study, because failure in this specific context meant leaving behind nothing durable enough to survive tens of thousands of years underground. Subscribe because the people who did make it left behind bones, tools, and bearskin cut marks that are still being read for the very first time, hundreds of thousands of years later, by people sitting somewhere warm with no idea how much labor it once took just to reach the next spring alive.